Good afternoon. Welcome to the Weekly Livestock Market Update. I'm Brownfield anchor reporter Megan Grebner. With us is livestock economist Scott Brown. Good afternoon, Scott.
Good afternoon, Megan.
I really wish that when I talk to you on at the end of the week, today we're talking on Thursday due to tomorrow's Good Friday holiday, I wish we could talk about better news, and it's really, we're going to talk about another negative week on the market. So let's start first and talk about what happened with cattle and hogs this week.
Yeah, so the only good news I have this week is it's opening day of baseball. So that's the good news we have for now. But livestock markets certainly have seen another week of downturn. Fed cattle prices were down about $5 this week. Feeder cattle as well were lower. I call that feeder cattle market 3 to 6 lower on some light tests as we come into this Easter holiday weekend. CME live cattle futures were down $3 this week, and the current CME feeder cattle contract was also $2 lower. Much of that weakness occurred here Thursday in both of those futures markets for live cattle and feeder cattle. If we look at the choice beef cutout value, it was down $2 this week. That was really on weakness across all the components of that choice beef cutout value. Still leaves it 1.5% above year-ago levels, but we're getting a lot closer to where we were a year ago on that choice beef cutout. If we go on the hog side of the equation, not good news there, as well as cash hog prices were down nearly $3 this week. And also those lean hog futures, the current contract down nearly $3 as well this week. We also saw the pork cutout value moving lower. It was down over $1 this week. Led by weakness across the board, and we now see belly prices that were 24% below where they were a year ago at this time. So a lot of not such positive news this week in terms of where cash markets have been.
Scott, as we take a look at what happened on the markets this week, I know when we talked last week, there was that the big announcement from China about the 25% tariffs on pork. How much of this negative trade rhetoric is pushing back and influencing what's going on with the markets and what we've seen this week?
Well, I certainly think the uncertainty, you could take hog markets in particular, and if you look at that current lean hog futures contract, it was trading lower almost every day this week. So I think people are continuing to build in more negative expectation as a result of added tariffs, and especially what we've seen happening relative to what the Chinese are doing in terms of U.S. pork. So I certainly think that has something to do with it, but you certainly have to look at the supply side of these markets as well and say both of those factors have not been, overly positive for where these prices are headed.
All right, the big news of the day on the livestock side of things, two big reports. First, let's get into Hogs and Pigs and looking at it. Not good news for hog producers, at least as we take a look at these numbers.
Yeah, so if we start with that Hogs and Pigs report, breeding inventory came in at 6.2 million head out of the report. That's a little outside the average trade report guessed, but still within the range. So it was expected, I guess, in terms of the additional breeding inventory. When you look at overall Hogs and Pigs up 3.1%, that came in smack dab on top of the pre-report average trade guess. So maybe not too much negative, but I just remind us, we're talking about 3% more Hogs and Pigs than we had a year ago. Does nothing but factor into more production. Looking at farrowing intentions to kind of get a sense of where we're headed as we go through the remainder of this year. Most of those came in very close to pre-report estimates as well, with March through May farrowing intentions coming in at 2.1% higher, and then June through August coming in at 1.4% higher. Both of those very near the average trade report guess. If you look at inventory by weight group, I think the only thing that really sticks out is that those hogs weighing greater than 180 pounds came in at 3.9% higher than a year ago. That's 0.4% above the average trade report guess, maybe suggesting we have a little larger run of hogs coming as we look over the next several weeks.
As we talk about that and we look at the fact that we're seeing increased processing capacity, we're increasing that shackle space, how does that come into play? Does that promote maybe growth in the pork sector? But what about, how concerned are we about a place to put all that product on the global market?
Yeah, I think that's the problem we face. There's certainly shackle space, and demand for hogs has been fairly good. But when you look at what's been happening to that pork cutout value, again, we're setting now nearly 10% below where we were a year ago at this time. It just tells you when you're adding in excess of 3% more production out there in terms of pork supplies this year, you're going to push that pork price down. And although we can talk about higher hog prices relative to that pork cutout value, we have to move product, and some of that product needs to move internationally if we're going to continue to talk about eventually higher hog prices for producers.
Adding more compounding on the negative news as we take a look at the livestock side of things this week, the Prospective Plantings report came out as really a surprise, I think, for a lot of folks.
Yeah, so markets certainly reacted quite positively on the crop side as a result of that. So, planting really the combination of corn and soybeans less than anybody would have thought. I think much of the pre-report rhetoric was around relative levels of corn and soybean plantings, but no one really would have called for overall corn and soybean acres to be down relative to where we were a year ago. Yet that's what USDA gave us today. And as a result, we've gotten corn futures contracts trading nearly 15 cents higher, and soybean contracts trading 25 cents higher. That's not good news when you think about what's been happening to meat prices generally moving lower. Now we're talking about feed costs that are now moving higher. So that squeeze, is a little concerning. Now, I remind us all the time, planting intentions at this point. It's been fairly wet here in Missouri with nothing really planted at this point. Yet another 25 cents on soybean prices. I kind of wonder what we actually get planted at the end of the day if we continue to see some of that price strength.
Anything else that we're looking at, or maybe we take away from that Prospective Plantings report as it comes back and as we take a look at the bottom line for our livestock producers?
Well, I guess the bottom line on the crop side is we knew we had feed costs that were much lower than we'd seen for a long period of time, and reminding ourselves that that's another chance to lock in some lower cost, or was a chance to lock in some lower cost. When we think about the fact that we've probably added about $80 a ton to soybean prices since the soybean meal prices since the first of the year, it just reminds us not to be too laid back in terms of feed costs have been low. They're always going to be low. I'm not going to lock those in. We want to continue to start to get ourselves in the mindset of what do we do come June, July this year in the U.S. And if we were to happily talk about a dry weather situation, are we as livestock producers protected during that dry weather period?
The one good news that we really have to talk about, we've talked about the negative trade rhetoric. There has been some positive news on the trade side of things coming out of discussions this week. Can we talk a little bit about the chorus agreement and what that potentially could mean as the renegotiations, the discussions and talks about renegotiations increase?
Yeah, so I think number one, the positive we got this week with an amended chorus agreement that continues to open markets for U.S. meat into Korea. Number one is that we're not going to see any retaliation, or it doesn't appear we would see retaliation from the tariffs we placed on things like steel coming from South Korea. So I think that helped markets ease their concern a little bit over those tariffs that we've imposed on products. Today, almost a majority of the U.S. pork that heads to Korea does go without any kind of tariff associated with it. But really on the beef side, that's where we're continuing to see reductions in tariffs from current levels. And I believe it's by 2025 or 2026, we're going to talk about beef also entering South Korea without tariff. So good news in terms of that long-term trade situation with South Korea.
I don't think we can get away from without talking about it this week, the drought conditions, as we take a look in some of those large cattle producing areas. What's going on as we take a look at Kansas, Texas, Oklahoma, and what does that mean for cattle producers in those areas?
Yeah, so we've seen this blob of dark red drought conditions continuing to expand in that area of Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, to the point that you have to really start thinking about what it might mean. You know, that looks an awful lot like the way we started 2012 here in the United States. Not that that's necessarily where we end up this year, but already producers in that area, number one, we saw calves that really had no wheat pasture go to feed yards a lot sooner than would have ever been the case. But now I think there's a lot of other changes coming from, do I move those cows somewhere else? Do I get rid of some of those cows? All those things we have to watch really carefully. I know the short term of that is if we start to talk about real herd liquidation as a result of what's going on there in that dry weather, we could talk about prices that are even lower as we push more cows into the market than otherwise would be the case. But the longer term of that, I remind my producers here in Missouri who, yes, we were dry for a period of time, but have gotten much better moisture of late, that could mean much higher cattle prices longer term if we talk about the same kind of liquidation that we would have seen, let's say, in a 2012. So there's pros and cons to this as it unfolds. And this is one of those where if you live in where the drought's occurring, it's a very, very bad situation. But for those producers that are living outside of the areas most affected, it can be a situation where it's a win for you in terms of what you see for cattle prices longer term.
I know I was looking at hay reports from Kansas earlier today and concerns about supply and having enough to make it through, and especially with the drought conditions. So it's something we'll have to continue to keep our eyes on.
Absolutely. I think that's the one that could be really a big event that could have a lot of influence on where we go, especially in cattle markets as we continue to move forward here over the next several weeks. And everybody needs to be paying attention to that drought situation there, even if it doesn't affect you locally. It's going to have effect on market prices if it continues to worsen.
Scott, anything else this week?
I think we've covered the main topics for this week, Megan.
As we take a look at next week, what are some reports that we're continuing to keep our eyes on?
Yeah, so next week we're going to get monthly trade data, so we get a little bit of help on what's been happening internationally. I hear a little bit of good news in terms of what moved in terms of beef exports here in the last week. We'll also get a jobs report next Friday, as well as we can talk about a restaurant performance index to give us, again, a little bit of measure of what's happening domestically.
Scott, have a great weekend, and we will talk to you next Friday.
That sounds great, Megan.
To have our weekly livestock market update delivered to your email box every Saturday morning, visit our website, brownfieldagnews.com. You can also submit questions and comments there as well. And for market updates twice daily, make sure to check out John Perkins' Market Minute. Have a great weekend. Happy Easter. I'm Megan Grebner on Brownfield.